I actually believe the Bible for many reasons, but for me, one of the crucial issues is the actual manuscript availability that we find within the sources. My understanding is that a historical source is only as good as the documents that it sits upon. And the evidence for the New Testament documents is extremely strong, particularly when you compare the source material for the secular sources of the time. Two of the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, for example, are written 400 years or so after his death by Arrian and by Plutarch, are considered by historians to be the strongest evidence for his life. And yet we're still finding them 400 or 500 years after he died in 323 BC. And yet for me the remarkable thing is that historians are still prepared to treat this as a key source document. And the same is true for some of the lateness of the manuscripts. If you take, for example, the Annals of Tacitus, written maybe 100 or 110 AD, the earliest available manuscript for him is not found until 850 AD. It's the same for the letters of Pliny, it's the same for the lives of Suetonius. The Bible manuscript evidence is much more compelling than some of the secular sources. If you take the earliest surviving codices of the New Testament, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, they both date from around about the middle of the 4th century AD. Now that immediately closes the window on the sources to a much shorter period than, for example, the Annals of Tacitus or the works of Pliny. And we can even push it further than that. If you take the earliest surviving manuscript fragment, which is one of the Rylands papyri held in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, we actually find that there's an early fragment of the Gospel of John. It contains just a few verses from John chapter 18. And it was found in Egypt, and historians have dated it to around about 125 or 130 AD. Now even the most liberal scholars will tell you that John, the Gospel writer, John the Apostle, died in the AD 90s, or perhaps as late as AD 100. So when you consider that this Gospel fragment of his is available 25 or 30 years after that, we get this remarkable piece of evidence that the scribe who was perhaps recording the fragment that we have was alive at the time that John the writer himself was alive. In other words, what the document does is take us right to the very heartbeat of the Gospel message, and it gives us something really significant to work with. Now you can add to this the number of manuscript copies which are still available. There are 8 copies, for example, for Herodotus, one of the so-called fathers of history. There's 7 copies of some of Aristotle's work. There's 20 copies left of Tacitus. And yet there's somewhere between 20,000 and 24,000 New Testament documents or New Testament fragments surviving. I suppose really the bottom line is this. The biographer of Jesus, who takes a look at the Gospel records as recorded in the New Testament, is on much safer ground and much surer ground than the biographer of, for example, Julius Caesar, or Alexander the Great, or Pliny the Younger. And I don't hear anybody arguing the evidence for their existence at any point in time. For me, the New Testament manuscript evidence is compelling enough, but if you add to that the most remarkable archaeological discovery of the 20th century, it seems that both the Old Testament and the New Testament documents stand up to scrutiny. Back in 1947, an Arab goat herder near Qumran, around the area of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into a cave, and he heard a strange noise. So he went to investigate and found in the cave and in caves nearby a variety of clay jars, and in the jars were leather documents. And what he didn't realise at the time, but what archaeologists and historians have later discovered, is that he had found what's become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most incredible manuscript discovery of the 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated to around about 100 BC. They're the most convincing and most complete record that we have of both Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts. It seems that there were some monastic farmers living around the area in the 1st century AD, and when the Romans took Jerusalem in AD 70, they tried to hide their manuscripts and hide their documents in these jars in the caves. One of the scrolls contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, and it's remarkable because it also antedates the previous oldest copy of the book of Isaiah by nearly 1,000 years. The Masoretic text was around 900 or 1,000 AD. This Dead Sea Scrolls copy is from around 100 BC. Normally you'd expect remarkable changes in a document over 1,000 years. That's a pretty long period of time. And yet what's remarkable for scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that that copy of Isaiah found in the caves in Qumran is virtually identical to the later Masoretic copy that dates from 900 or 1,000 AD. You would expect to find many more changes than you do, and even the changes and the variations which are there are pretty negligible. They certainly don't impact on anything central to the Gospel or central to Isaiah's message. I spent a lot of time working with old manuscripts and working with old books, And it seems to me that the Bible more than passes the tests that historians lay down when they work with ancient source material. And I find that that means that when I come to the Bible, or when anyone else comes to the Bible, they can treat it not merely as a book of old documents, a book of old manuscripts, but as something living and powerful, containing a message for us today.